Welcome to the Concierge Care Health System podcast. The information shared in this podcast is for general informational purposes only and does not constitute medical advice. Listeners should be aware the content is not a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always consult with a physician or other qualified healthcare provider for medical questions.
Oh, wait. Let's unpack this. We are plunging into a topic that is quite literally heating up our world. I mean, summer 2024 was recorded as the hottest in history, right? And 2025 is already slated to be one of the 5 warmest. It feels like this isn't just an anomaly anymore. Extreme heat is fast becoming, well, our new baseline. And here's the profound paradox at the heart of our deep dive today. Sun and heat are absolutely essential for life itself, yet they're also a source of significant morbidity and mortality.
Yeah, that's the real tension here.
Think about it. Sunlight drives vitamin D synthesis, which is crucial for our bone integrity and immune health. Yet this same solar radiation is a primary carcinogen. It's responsible for nearly 6 million skin cancers treated annually just in the U.S. That's huge. And similarly, while ambient heat is, a natural environmental factor, extreme heat is the leading weather-related killer in many developed nations. Plus, its lethal impacts are amplified by something called the urban heat island effect, where cities get significantly warmer than surrounding rural areas.
Absolutely. And what's particularly striking is how organizations like the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and the WHO, the World Health Organization, they've unequivocally identified climate change as what they call a threat multiplier.
A threat multiplier. What does that mean exactly in this context?
Well, it's not just a label. It means climate change is actively intensifying the frequency, the duration, and the severity of these extreme heat events. So it's directly contributing to what's really a burgeoning global health crisis.
And that's exactly our mission today, isn't it? This deep dive is going to deconstruct this really complex issue. We're going to argue that while sun and heat exposure are undeniably beneficial in some ways, their increasing intensity and frequency, driven by climate change, pose a cascading and profoundly inequitable threat to global public health. We'll cover everything from the fundamental biophysics and physiology, through the pathological consequences, human vulnerability, economic and cultural dimensions, right down to mitigation strategies. Our goal is really to equip you, the listener, to be truly well-informed on this critical, evolving challenge. So maybe let's start with the sun itself. When we talk about the sun and your skin, what are the most critical distinctions our listeners need to understand about how different types of UV rays impact us?
That's a great place to start. So sunlight contains a spectrum of radiation, right? But for skin health, we're primarily concerned with 2 types of ultraviolet radiation, UVA and UVB.
UVA and UVB.
UVA rays have a longer wavelength, and they actually account for up to 95% of the UV radiation that reaches the Earth's surface. They're kind of the silent penetrators. They go deep into the skin's dermal layer, causing long-term damage like photoaging, wrinkles, dark spots. And critically, UVA contributes significantly to skin cancer by causing indirect DNA damage.
Indirect damage, how does that work?
Yeah, it generates reactive oxygen species that then damage the DNA.
Yeah.
And what makes UVA so insidious is its pervasive nature. Its intensity stays pretty consistent all day, all year round, and it can even penetrate clouds and glass.
Wow. Okay. So UVA is this deep, consistent threat. What about UVB then?
Right. So on the other hand, UVB rays have a shorter wavelength. They mostly affect the superficial layer of the skin, the epidermis. This is the main culprit behind sunburn. And it's a potent carcinogen because it directly damages DNA. But unlike UVA, UVB intensity fluctuates quite dramatically. It peaks during midday and in the summer months.
And what's the actual mechanism here? You mentioned DNA damage, but how does UV radiation lead to something as serious as cancer?
Yeah, the molecular mechanism of UV-induced damage is really at the heart of its carcinogenicity. So unprotected exposure to both UVA and UVB damages our genetic material, our DNA, within skin cells. This produces mutations. Now, our bodies do have sophisticated repair systems, but they're not infallible.
Right, they can get overwhelmed.
Exactly. Over a lifetime, the accumulation of unrepaired DNA damage can lead cells to grow and divide uncontrollably, and that's what forms cancerous tumors. A key player here is the p53 tumor suppressor gene. It's often called the guardian of the genome because it acts like a critical quality control system in our cells.
Guardian of the genome, I like that.
Yeah. So when UV radiation mutates p53, those damaged cells can basically escape the body's natural cleanup process and proliferate, setting the stage for a tumor. And here's a really stark fact. A sunburn isn't just temporary discomfort. It's unequivocal evidence of widespread cellular DNA damage.
That's sobering.
It is. And having just one blistering sunburn in childhood or adolescence more than doubles your lifetime risk of developing melanoma, which is the deadliest form of skin cancer.
Wow, just one. That's a really important distinction often missed. So if SPF on sunscreen primarily covers UVB, what should listeners be looking for to ensure they're protected against those deeper, insidious UVA rays? Exactly. That's a crucial point because what's often lost in public health messaging is that while SPF primarily measures protection against UVB, the rays that cause sunburn, it doesn't always guarantee broad-spectrum protection against UVA.
Which can create a false sense of security, right?
Precisely. And UVA is a major driver of melanoma, often through that indirect DNA damage pathway we talked about. In fact, something like 92% of all melanomas lack the direct UV signature mutation that's characteristic of UVB damage. That strongly implicates UVA as a primary cause.
That's fascinating and really concerning.
It really underscores the need for public health communication to stress the distinct and insidious threat of UVA. It's present even on cloudy days and penetrates window glass. So basically, you need to look for sunscreen labeled broad spectrum. That's key.
Got it. Broad spectrum. Okay, so that's the sun's powerful double-edged sword when it comes to our skin. But of course, the sun isn't the only environmental force we're grappling with. Let's shift our focus now to the equally critical challenge of heat itself. How does our body handle the heat, and, well, when does it reach a breaking point?
Right. So our bodies are incredibly precise machines, in a way. They work hard to maintain a core temperature of about 37 degrees Celsius, or 98.6 Fahrenheit. This stability comes from a dynamic process called thermoregulation, which is governed by what's called the heat balance equation. Basically, if the heat your body produces internally, plus the heat it gains from the environment, exceeds its ability to lose heat, your core temperature starts to rise. That leads to physiological heat strain.
Okay, and what does our body do to fight back against that rising temperature? What are the mechanisms?
Your hypothalamus, deep in your brain, acts as the body's thermostat. When it detects a temperature increase, it orchestrates two main responses to dissipate heat. First, cutaneous vasodilation. That's where blood vessels in the skin widen to shunt warm blood to the surface, allowing heat to radiate away.
Okay.
Second, sweating. Millions of sweat glands produce sweat that evaporates from the skin. This is a really powerful cooling mechanism because evaporation pulls heat directly from the skin surface.
This sounds like a very finely tuned system. So when does it become overwhelmed? When does it fail?
Well, the efficacy of this system really defines the line between manageable heat exposure and dangerous heat exposure. Heat stress is considered compensable as long as your body can evaporate enough sweat to maintain a steady core temperature.
Compensable, okay.
But when environmental conditions, especially high ambient humidity, limit sweat evaporation, the body enters a state of uncompensable heat stress. This is where the primary cooling mechanism fails.
Can you explain that a bit more? Why does humidity matter so much?
Think of it this way. When high humidity saturates the air with water vapor, it's like the air is already full. Your sweat, which is your body's primary cooling mechanism via evaporation, simply can't evaporate effectively into that saturated air. It just sits on your skin, and you can't cool down.
That's a great analogy. So heat risk isn't just about how hot the thermometer says it is, but how effectively you can actually sweat and have it evaporate.
Precisely. In uncompensable heat stress, heat is continuously stored, and core body temperature rises uncontrollably. This leads directly to severe heat-related illness and potentially heat stroke. This distinction is crucial because heat risk isn't just about high temperatures. It's fundamentally about failed evaporation. This is why public health warnings increasingly rely on the heat index, which combines air temperature and relative humidity.
Right, I've seen those warnings.
Yeah, so for example, a 95-degree Fahrenheit day with 90% humidity can impose a far greater and more dangerous physiological strain than, say, a 105-degree day with only 10% humidity. Because in that humid scenario, your evaporative cooling system is basically rendered ineffective.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. We've explored the essential benefits of sun exposure, but now it's crucial to pivot to the significant risks of overexposure. So let's talk about skin cancer. You mentioned it's the most common malignancy in the U.S. What are the facts here?
Yeah, the numbers are pretty shocking, actually. It is the most common malignancy in the United States. It's estimated that about 1 in 5 Americans will develop skin cancer in their lifetime.
1 in 5.
And about 90% of these cancers are directly associated with UV radiation, either from the sun or from tanning beds. Now, while melanoma only accounts for about 1% of all skin cancer cases, it's responsible for the vast majority of skin cancer-related deaths. And the incidence of melanoma has been rising alarmingly. There's been something like a 46% increase in new invasive melanomas diagnosed annually in the U.S. in just the past 15 years.
46%, that's staggering.
It is. For 2025, the American Cancer Society projects nearly 105,000 new cases of invasive melanoma and over 8,400 deaths from the disease.
So what are the different types of skin cancer we should be aware of, and what makes melanoma in particular so dangerous?
Okay, the primary types linked to UV exposure are basal cell carcinoma, or BCC. That's the most prevalent, usually appearing on chronically sun-exposed areas like the face and neck. It's generally slow-growing and has a low metastasis rate, meaning it doesn't spread often, but it can cause significant local destruction if left untreated.
Okay, BCC. What else?
Then there's squamous cell carcinoma, SCC. That's the second most common. It has a higher potential to spread than BCC, especially in the elderly or immunocompromised individuals. And then there's melanoma. As we said, it's the least common, but by far the most aggressive and deadliest.
Why is it so aggressive?
It has a high propensity to metastasize, to spread to other parts of the body if it's not detected early. And its risk is strongly correlated with a history of intense, intermittent sun exposure that results in sunburn, especially during childhood. The pathogenesis, the way it develops, begins with that UV-induced DNA damage we discussed, specifically mutations in genes like P53, which allows damaged cells to proliferate.
And is it just UV damage?
Well, that's a key insight from recent research. It seems there could be cofactors. Certain common skin viruses, like beta human papillomavirus or beta HPV, have been identified as potential co-carcinogens.
Viruses? Really?
Yeah. Particularly in immunocompromised individuals, this virus seems to actively drive the transformation of cells into squamous cell carcinoma. So it shows a complex interplay between UV damage, viral infection, and the person's immune status. It's not always just a simple one-to-one cause and effect.
Fascinating. Okay, so beyond cancer, extreme heat itself can lead to a whole spectrum of heat-related illnesses. Could you walk us through those, maybe from the milder end to the most severe?
Absolutely. And it's important to see these not as distinct diseases, but more as a continuum of physiological distress. So at the milder end, you have things like heat rash and heat cramps, and there's heat syncope, which is basically fainting or dizziness from prolonged standing or maybe suddenly standing up in a hot environment. It's usually caused by dehydration and reduced blood flow to the brain.
Okay, that sounds unpleasant, but maybe not life-threatening. What comes next?
Next up is heat exhaustion, which is definitely more serious. It results from extensive loss of water and salt through sweating. Symptoms typically include headache, nausea, dizziness, weakness, heavy sweating, and a fast, weak pulse. A key diagnostic feature here is that the skin is often cool, pale, and clammy, even though the core body temperature is elevated, usually below 103 degrees Fahrenheit or about 39.4 Celsius. The person is usually conscious and coherent, though they might feel weak or dizzy.
So heat exhaustion is serious, but generally manageable with the right steps. What's the critical difference, then, that makes heat stroke a true emergency?
This is where the critical distinction lies, because heat stroke is absolutely a life-threatening medical emergency. It happens when the body's temperature-regulating system completely fails. This leads to a rapid and uncontrolled rise in core body temperature, often soaring to 106 degrees Fahrenheit, that's over 41 Celsius, or even higher within minutes.
106 or higher, wow.
Yeah. And the cardinal sign, the absolute key indicator of heat stroke, is a significant change in mental status. This can include confusion, agitation, slurred speech, delirium, seizures, or even loss of consciousness.
And what about sweating? I thought people stopped sweating with heat stroke.
Well, in classic heat stroke, often seen in elderly people during heat waves, the sweating mechanism does indeed fail, and the skin becomes hot and dry. However, in exertional heat stroke, which you often see during intense physical activity, the individual might still be sweating profusely. So you can't rely on lack of sweating alone.
That's a really important distinction.
It is. And beyond these primary conditions, severe heat stress can also trigger something called rhabdomyolysis.
Rhabdomyolysis, what's that?
It's a dangerous condition where muscle fibers break down rapidly and release harmful substances like myoglobin into the bloodstream. These substances can then severely damage the kidneys, potentially leading to acute kidney injury and even failure.
Goodness. So the management must be very different for heat exhaustion versus heat stroke.
Vastly different. Heat exhaustion can often be managed by moving the person to a cool place and giving them fluids to rehydrate. But heat stroke demands immediate emergency medical intervention. You call 911 or your local emergency number immediately and start aggressive cooling measures while waiting for help. The key differentiating signs to remember are that altered mental status and a core body temperature typically above 103 degrees air or 39.4 degrees C air.
That's a lot to take, and the sheer scope of this issue is truly vast. But it also highlights why understanding these underlying mechanisms is so critical. And the toll isn't just immediate, is it? It sounds like both UV radiation and severe heat can leave a lasting legacy of chronic disease and permanent disability.
That's a crucial point to understand. The damage from UV radiation is fundamentally cumulative. Every instance of sun exposure, whether it results in a tan or a burn, adds to a lifetime accumulation of DNA mutations in your skin cells. This progressive damage steadily increases the risk of developing skin cancer over time. It's not just about the one bad burn.
So it adds up over years.
Exactly. And beyond cancer, this cumulative damage also leads to photoaging, those visible signs of premature skin aging, like wrinkles, leathery texture, age spots. That's caused by the degradation of collagen and elastin fibers in the skin.
Okay, and what about heat stroke? You mentioned it's a life-threatening emergency. What are the long-term consequences for survivors? Is it something you fully recover from?
That's the critical thing. Heat stroke should not be viewed as just a temporary illness with a guaranteed full recovery. The extreme hyperthermia involved can trigger a systemic inflammatory response, problems with blood coagulation, and direct cellular injury, leading to permanent damage to vital organs.
Which organs are most vulnerable?
The brain, in particular, is extremely vulnerable to heat. Without rapid and effective cooling, heat stroke can cause brain swelling and irreversible neuronal damage. Consequently, survivors often face a range of long-term neurological deficits. This can include persistent trouble with muscle coordination and balance, a condition known as cerebellar ataxia, and also slurred or difficult speech, which is called dysarthria.
So potential brain damage, that's terrifying.
It is. And damage to the heart and kidneys can also be permanent, leading to chronic organ dysfunction down the line. This evidence really means we must reframe heat stroke. Think of it as an acute traumatic injury with the potential for lifelong disability, similar maybe to how we view a cerebrovascular stroke or a traumatic brain injury.
That's a powerful reframing.
Yeah, and the CDC explicitly states that heat stroke can cause permanent disability or death. This perspective really underscores the absolute criticality of prevention and also justifies the need for long-term medical follow-up for anyone who survives an episode of heat stroke.
Wow. Framing heat stroke as an acute traumatic injury with lifelong disability potential completely changes how I view it. That's a profound shift in perspective. And as you alluded to earlier, these health risks aren't distributed uniformly across the population, are they? Who is most vulnerable to the impacts of sun and heat?
That's right. Vulnerability is really shaped by two main things: intrinsic biological characteristics, and perhaps even more powerfully, by socioeconomic and environmental factors.
Okay, let's start with the intrinsic, the biological factors.
Sure. Age is one of the most significant. Both ends of the lifespan are concentrated risk zones. Infants and young children, say up to age 4, are especially vulnerable. Their central nervous systems, which control thermoregulation, aren't fully developed yet. They also have a smaller cardiovascular output relative to their body size and a higher metabolic rate, making them less efficient at dissipating heat. And crucially, they're entirely dependent on caregivers for hydration, appropriate clothing, and getting out of the heat.
Right, total dependence. So children are more susceptible. What about older adults?
Older adults, generally those 65 and older, face kind of a confluence of risks. The aging process itself leads to a less responsive central nervous system and often a diminished ability to sense thirst.
So they might not realize they're getting dehydrated.
Exactly. Plus, they're more likely to have pre-existing chronic conditions like heart disease or diabetes, and they're often on medications, like diuretics or certain blood pressure medications like beta blockers, that can interfere with the body's ability to regulate temperature or sweat properly.
Okay, so age is a big factor at both ends. Are there any other biological states that influence vulnerability?
Yes. Pregnancy is another state of heightened vulnerability. Pregnant individuals are generally more susceptible to heat-related illness, and extreme heat poses direct risks to the developing fetus too, including an increased likelihood of preterm birth and low birth weight.
And what about for UV-related risks, like skin cancer? Does biology play a role there too?
Absolutely. For UV risks, skin type and genetics are paramount. Individuals with fair skin that burns easily and rarely tans, along with light-colored hair and eyes, has the least natural melanin protection. Melanin is the pigment that gives skin some natural defense. So these individuals are at the highest risk for all forms of skin cancer. A family history of skin cancer also significantly increases personal risk.
And these genetic predispositions lead to disparities we see across different populations.
They do. They lead to some stark racial disparities in incidence rates. For example, non-Hispanic white populations in the U.S. have a melanoma incidence rate that is something like 34 times higher than that of non-Hispanic black populations.
34 times higher. Wow. Okay, now let's shift to the geography of risk. You said that while biology defines potential for harm, it's often the social and economic environment that determines actual exposure and the capacity to adapt. Can you explain the urban heat island effect you mentioned earlier and how it plays into this inequity?
Right, the urban heat island effect is a major driver of this inequitable exposure. Cities, with their dense concentrations of dark, heat-absorbing surfaces like asphalt roads and rooftops, and often a relative lack of cooling vegetation like trees and parks. Well, they can be several degrees Celsius or quite a few degrees Fahrenheit warmer than adjacent rural areas.
Several degrees warmer just because of the built environment.
Exactly. This transforms cities into dangerous hotspots during heat waves. And the burden isn't shared equally among residents within the city either.
And it goes beyond just city design, doesn't it? It seems like socioeconomic status is a really powerful predictor of heat vulnerability.
Absolutely. Low-income communities consistently face a higher risk. Why? Often it's due to lack of access to air conditioning, which is the single most effective protective measure against heat illness, or sometimes the inability to afford the high electricity costs, even if they have AC.
Right, the energy burden.
Precisely.
Right.
They're also more likely to live in poorly insulated buildings, maybe top-floor apartments that trap heat, and their neighborhoods often suffer from a lack of green space and tree canopy compared to wealthier areas.
You might expect certain populations to be more vulnerable based on income, but what's truly astonishing or maybe disturbing is how deeply rooted these disparities seem to be in historical and structural inequities. Can you elaborate on that connection?
Yeah, this is really unsettling. There are stark racial and ethnic disparities in heat vulnerability, and they are deeply rooted in historical injustices. In the U.S., for instance, a legacy of discriminatory housing policies like redlining, where banks literally drew red lines on maps around minority neighborhoods, deeming them too risky for investment, systematically segregated communities of color into the least desirable urban areas.
Decades ago, but the effects linger today.
Decades later, these very same neighborhoods are often the hottest parts of a city. They're characterized by more pavement, fewer parks and trees, and older, less resilient infrastructure. This creates a direct, measurable link between systemic racism and modern-day heat exposure risks.
So past policies are literally making present-day heat waves more dangerous for certain communities.
Exactly. And as a result, data consistently show that populations like American Indian, Alaska Native, and Black populations experience significantly higher rates of heat-related death compared to their white counterparts.
Yeah.
And it's crucial to understand these disparities are not a result of biological differences. They're an engineered outcome of structural inequities that lead to both higher exposure levels and lower adaptive capacity. Things like less access to healthcare, cooling, information.
That's a critical point.
This whole body of evidence really reveals that heat vulnerability isn't primarily about individual failings or personal biology. It's a symptom of systemic inequity. While public health narratives often focus on individual advice, drink water, stay cool, a deeper analysis shows that the most powerful predictors of who suffers and dies from extreme heat are structural: a person's income, their race, and their zip code. This really reframes the problem from being a purely medical issue to one of environmental justice.
Environmental justice, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Building on that, certain occupations must carry an inherently high risk of heat-related illness, too. Who is most at risk in the workplace?
Definitely. Outdoor workers are on the front lines. Think about sectors like construction, agriculture, landscaping, and also emergency services like firefighters. They face a dual burden: high environmental heat exposure from direct sun and high internal metabolic heat production from doing strenuous physical labor.
A double whammy.
Exactly. But indoor workers aren't immune either. Anyone working in environments without effective climate control, places like foundries, commercial kitchens, warehouses, factories, they also face significant risk.
And the impact of this occupational heat stress, it must go beyond just the immediate health risks, right? Does it affect productivity?
Oh, absolutely. It has significant economic consequences. Heat stress demonstrably reduces labor productivity. For heavy physical work, studies show productivity begins to decline when the wet bulb globe temperature, that's a composite measure considering heat, humidity, wind, and solar radiation, sort of the gold standard for assessing occupational heat stress.
Wet bulb globe temperature. Okay.
Right, WBGT. Productivity starts dropping when that exceeds just 77 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 25 Celsius. That's not even excessively hot by some standards.
So it's not just a health issue for the workers, but it becomes an economic one for businesses and even whole nations.
For sure. If we connect this to the bigger picture, current global productivity losses due to heat are estimated to be nearly 10%. That's huge. And projections suggest this could rise to 30–40% by the end of the century under worst-case climate scenarios.
30 to 40% loss in productivity.
Yeah. In the U.S. specifically, these productivity losses are projected to have long-lasting macroeconomic impacts. Things like reducing the nation's accumulated capital stock by 5.4% and annual consumption by 1.8% by the year 2200.
Yeah.
And the construction sector is expected to be the primary driver of these losses.
So preventing occupational heat illness is critical for both public health and the economy. What works?
Absolutely. A key principle is acclimatization. That's the process where the body gradually adapts to working in the heat over several days or weeks. Data from OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, show that nearly 3 out of 4 fatalities from heat illness happen during an employee's first week on the job.
First week, that really highlights the danger of sudden exposure.
It does. It shows how crucial gradual adaptation is. So OSHA promotes strategies like the 20% rule for new or returning workers, basically. Don't work more than 20% of a normal shift duration in the heat on day one, and gradually increase exposure over the first week or two. And essential employer-led strategies include things you'd expect: providing ample cool water, mandating paid rest breaks in shaded or cool areas, providing light-colored and breathable clothing if possible, and really robust training programs on recognizing symptoms and prevention.
Okay, let's talk about the costs more broadly. The economic burden of all the sun and heat exposure sounds truly staggering. Can you give us a sense of the scale in terms of dollars?
Yeah, the numbers are quite large. The direct medical costs just for treating skin cancer in the United States alone amount to approximately $8.9 billion annually.
Nearly $9 billion a year just for skin cancer treatment.
That's right, and it's broken down into about $6.5 billion for the non-melanoma types like BCC and SCC, and about $2.5 billion for melanoma. And these costs are not static, they're rising fast. The annual cost for skin cancer treatment nationwide grew by 126% between the early 2000s and the early 2010s.
126% increase.
Yeah, that's a rate 5 times faster than the cost growth for all other cancers combined during that period.
5 times faster. Wow. And what about the cost to an individual patient? Does it vary much?
Oh, dramatically.
Yeah.
Treating an early-stage melanoma might be around $1,700, give or take.
Yeah.
But a late-stage metastatic melanoma, that can easily exceed $56,000 for initial treatment phases. And some of the modern immunotherapy drugs used for advanced melanoma, like Keytruda, carry a list price of over $20,000 per infusion.
$20,000 per infusion. And what about the broader economic impact beyond just those direct medical bills? Are there indirect costs?
Absolutely. This raises an important point. Beyond direct medical bills, there are significant indirect costs. Think about lost productivity from work due to illness, disability, or tragically, premature mortality. And there are also the costs incurred by informal caregivers, family members who have to take time off work. Those add up too.
And the economic impact of extreme heat, is it similar?
It's similarly severe, yes. Extreme heat events are estimated to generate at least $1 billion in excess healthcare costs each year in the U.S., just from increased emergency department visits and hospitalizations during heat waves. But perhaps the even larger economic impact comes from those productivity losses we were just discussing. Studies show that for every 10 additional days with temperatures above 35 degrees Celsius, that's 95 Fahrenheit, annual labor productivity is reduced by about 0.3%.
It all adds up.
It really does. And when you view these multi-billion-dollar annual costs in aggregate from both skin cancer and heat illness, you can almost see them functioning as a massive, regressive climate tax.
A climate tax? How so?
Well, it's disproportionately levied on public funds and borne by the elderly. Medicare, for example, is the largest single payer for skin cancer treatment in the U.S. That's a direct consequence of the highest prevalence occurring in adults age 65 and older. So this really reframes prevention. It's not merely a public health strategy, it's also becoming a fiscal imperative.
A fiscal imperative. That's a strong statement. Okay, now let's explore some of the fascinating cultural dimensions around this. Our behavior, particularly around sun exposure, isn't just about understanding health risks, is it? It's also powerfully shaped by cultural values and sometimes shifting beauty ideals. Can you tell us about the historical shift in the West?
Oh, it's quite a story, actually. In Western cultures, We've seen a dramatic reversal of these ideals over time. For centuries, literally centuries, pale, untanned skin was the ideal. It was a symbol of wealth and nobility, signifying a life of leisure spent indoors, away from manual labor in the sun.
Right. You see that in old portraits.
Exactly. But then, starting around the 1920s, propelled partly by fashion icons like Coco Chanel, who supposedly got accidentally sunburned on a yacht trip and made it look chic, and also by the growing popularity of outdoor recreation and travel, the suntan was transformed. It became a desirable symbol of beauty, health, vitality, and a luxurious active lifestyle.
From undesirable to highly desirable.
Completely flipped. And despite decades now of public health campaigns warning about UV dangers, this pro-tanning culture remains a really potent force in many Western societies, particularly among adolescents and young adults. Research from places like Australia, a country with very high rates of skin cancer, reveals that most young adults still desire a suntan. It's powerfully reinforced by social media trends that constantly normalize and glamorize tanned skin.
Social media's influence. And does this Western ideal of the pan contrast with ideals in other parts of the world?
It absolutely does, in many places. In numerous Asian cultures, for example, the historical preference for fair skin as a marker of beauty, purity, and high social status persists strongly. This cultural value system actively encourages sun avoidance behaviors, things like using umbrellas for shade, wearing long sleeves and hats even when it's hot, and it drives a huge market for skin lightening products.
So opposite behaviors driven by opposite beauty ideals.
Pretty much. However, these norms aren't static either. Globalization and the influence of Western media are introducing the tanned look as a fashionable, albeit maybe niche, ideal in some urban centers across Asia now too.
Interesting. So cultures are influencing each other.
The crucial takeaway here, I think, is that sun exposure behavior is fundamentally driven by the socially constructed meaning of skin tone in a particular culture. A public health warning just listing the dangers of tanning will likely have little impact if the perceived social benefits of that tan, like attractiveness or fitting in with your peers, outweigh the abstract, long-term health risk in someone's mind.
So interventions need to be culturally tailored.
Exactly. To be effective, they have to be. In Western societies, this might involve leveraging appearance-based messaging. That means highlighting the negative cosmetic consequences of sun damage, like picture wrinkles or sunspots, which can actually be a more powerful motivator for young people than the threat of cancer decades down the road.
Appeal to vanity, maybe.
In a sense, yes, or at least acknowledging that appearance is a strong driver. It might also involve working directly with social media influencers to try and challenge the glamorization of tanning online.
Right. So even when individuals are aware of the risks, perhaps intellectually, there's often this persistent gap between that knowledge and actually doing something consistently, like using sunscreen or seeking shade. What are some of the psychological reasons for that gap?
That's a really common challenge in health behavior change. Several cognitive and emotional barriers can get in the way of adopting sun-safe practices. These can include things like fatalistic attitudes, "Oh, I'll get cancer anyway," or "It won't happen to me." Sometimes it's a lack of trust in healthcare institutions or the source of the message. And often it's simpler things like just forgetfulness or perceiving the protective measures as inconvenient, uncomfortable, or maybe even lazy or unfashionable.
The inconvenience factor is big, I think. Grabbing a hat, putting on sunscreen.
It is. And this raises the important question: how do we bridge that gap? If just telling people the facts isn't enough, what else works? Well, social psychology offers some useful frameworks. The theory of planned behavior, for example, provides a good lens. It posits that a person's intention to perform a behavior is shaped by 3 core beliefs.
Okay, what are they?
First, their attitude towards the behavior. Do they think it's good or bad? Second, their perception of social pressure, what they think others expect, often called subjective norms. And third, their confidence in their ability to actually perform the behavior, that's perceived behavioral control or self-efficacy.
Attitude, social norms, and self-efficacy.
Right, and this framework really highlights the immense power of the social context, those subjective norms. Interventions that incorporate social norms information have actually proven particularly effective for things like sun protection.
How does that work in practice?
Well, these interventions go beyond just providing the health facts. They provide information about what peers are actually doing and what's socially approved within their group. For example, telling college students that actually most of their peers use sunscreen regularly can significantly increase their own sun protection behaviors because it shifts their perception of the norm.
Interesting. So it taps into that desire to fit in.
Exactly. And the effect seems to be even stronger when this normative information is paired with a compelling, appearance-based intervention, like showing participants a UV photograph that reveals the hidden underlying sun damage to their own skin, damage they can't see with the naked eye.
Oh, I've heard about those UV photos. They can be quite shocking.
They can be. So this combination directly targets both the desire to conform to social norms, my peers are doing this,
Yeah.
and the immediate concern for personal appearance. Wow, look at the hidden damage. And that often proves more motivating, especially for younger people, than just abstract health warnings alone.
Okay, so given this multifaceted threat, the biology, the environment, the economics, the culture, the psychology, how can we best defend ourselves? What does an effective, multi-layered strategy look like? Starting maybe at the individual level.
Right, starting with individual actions. Leading public health organizations like the CDC and the WHO generally recommend 5 core pillars of sun protection whenever the UV index is 3 or higher.
Okay, 5 pillars. What are they?
1. Seek shade, especially during peak UV hours, roughly 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. 2. Wear protective clothing, like long-sleeve shirts and pants, preferably tightly woven fabrics. 3. Wear a broad-brimmed hat that shades your face, neck, and ears. 4. Wear UV-blocking sunglasses to protect your eyes and the sensitive skin around them. And 5. Use a broad-spectrum sunscreen with an SPF of 30 or higher. Apply it generously and reapply frequently, especially after swimming or sweating.
Shade, clothing, hats, sunglasses, sunscreen. Got it. And for protection against extreme heat?
For heat, individual behaviors include staying well hydrated, drinking plenty of water even before you feel thirsty, avoiding or rescheduling strenuous outdoor activities to cooler parts of the day, like early morning or evening, wearing lightweight, loose-fitting, light-colored clothing, and taking cool showers or baths can also help lower your body temperature.
These individual actions seem crucial, common sense even, but how can public health campaigns amplify their effectiveness and reach more people?
Well, these individual actions are definitely most effective when they're supported and reinforced by widespread public health campaigns. And these campaigns can have a significant return on investment. Mass media campaigns for skin cancer prevention, for instance, have shown a societal return of about $3.85 for every $1 invested, mainly through averted healthcare costs and reduced mortality.
That's a good return.
It is. And as we just discussed, these interventions tend to be most successful when they are psychologically sophisticated, when they target social norms, and maybe use that appearance-based messaging that resonates more strongly with high-risk groups like young people than just abstract health warnings alone.
Makes sense. Now, beyond individual behavior change, creating safer environments through physical and engineering adaptation seems really important. These can provide broad, passive protection, particularly in vulnerable urban areas. What are some of the most impactful strategies there?
Urban greening is definitely one of the most effective and beneficial strategies we have for climate adaptation in cities. This basically involves increasing tree canopy cover and creating more green spaces like parks and gardens.
And how does that help specifically with heat and sun?
Trees provide direct shade, obviously, which would dramatically lower surface temperatures of pavement and buildings. But they also cool the ambient air through a process called evapotranspiration, basically, releasing water vapor, like natural air conditioners. This helps mitigate the overall urban heat island effect, reducing the heat load on a whole neighborhood and, as a side benefit, lowering energy demand for air conditioning in buildings.
And the advantages of urban greening probably go beyond just temperature reduction, right?
Oh, absolutely. The co-benefits are huge. Living in greener neighborhoods is strongly associated with improved physical and mental health outcomes across the board. And this can translate into tangible economic savings. There was a landmark study of over 5 million people in Northern California that found individuals living in neighborhoods with the most green space had annual healthcare costs that were, on average, $374 lower per person than those living in the least green areas.
$374 per person per year, lower healthcare costs. That's significant when you scale it up.
It really is. So investments in urban parks and green infrastructure can generate substantial economic returns, partly by reducing the societal costs associated with physical inactivity and mental illness, which green spaces help alleviate.
Okay, so greening is key. What about other infrastructure strategies?
Another important strategy is what's sometimes called cool infrastructure. This involves deploying building materials and technologies specifically designed to reflect more solar radiation and absorb less heat. The most common examples are cool roofs and cool pavements. These use light-colored reflective materials instead of traditional dark asphalt or roofing. They can significantly lower surface temperatures, which in turn reduces ambient air temperatures nearby and also lowers building energy costs for cooling.
Cool roofs and cool pavements. Makes sense. And then there are cooling centers, which seem like a logical emergency response during heat waves. How effective are they in reality?
That's a good question. Cooling centers are basically publicly accessible, air-conditioned facilities, often libraries, community centers, sometimes schools designated as places of refuge during extreme heat events. On the surface, they seem like a great idea. But the real-world effectiveness is actually baited, and the direct evidence linking cooling center use to improve health outcomes during heat waves is surprisingly limited.
Really? Why is that?
Well, laboratory simulations do show that spending time at a cooling center provides robust physiological benefits. It lowers core temperature, reduces heart rate strain. But these benefits are often transient. They start to disappear pretty soon after the person returns to their hot home environment.
So it's temporary relief, but maybe not enough?
It can be. And the bigger issue seems to be utilization. The primary challenge is that cooling centers often suffer from extremely low usage rates, even during severe heat waves.
It sounds like a logical solution, yet the data shows it's not being fully utilized. Why aren't people using them more?
There seem to be several major barriers. Lack of public awareness, people just don't know they exist or where they are. Sometimes inconvenient or limited operating hours, transportation difficulties, especially for elderly or disabled individuals, and sometimes there's a social stigma associated with using them. As a result, even during major heat emergencies, many designated cooling centers operate at just a fraction of their capacity.
So what does that suggest about their role?
Well, it suggests that while cooling centers are probably a necessary last resort safety net, they are likely an insufficient strategy on their own, especially as a long-term solution. A potentially more sustainable, effective, and equitable strategy is to prioritize those proactive, permanent environmental modifications we talked about. Urban greening, for example, offers continuous passive cooling to an entire community, benefiting everyone, including those who can't or won't travel to a designated center. It addresses the root cause of the urban heat problem, rather than just treating the symptom for a relatively small number of people who manage to access a center.
Right, focusing on prevention and systemic change rather than just emergency response. Okay, all these strategies, individual, public health, environmental, they must be viewed through the lens of the overarching driver that's increasing the risk in the first place: global climate change. What does the science tell us about how climate change is specifically impacting these extremes of sun and heat?
The scientific consensus here, as articulated most prominently by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, is unequivocal. The IPCC's sixth assessment report, which came out recently, states with high confidence that human-caused climate change is already making heat waves more frequent, longer in duration, and more intense across essentially the entire globe.
Already happening, not just a future problem.
Already happening.
Yeah.
And the report projects that every additional increment of global warming will continue to amplify these extremes. The relationship is pretty direct. The upcoming seventh assessment report, which is scheduled for release by late 2029, will undoubtedly further refine these projections, likely showing continued worsening trends.
And what are the projected health impacts of this escalation in heat extremes?
So the projected health impacts are frankly dire. The World Health Organization estimates that between 2030 and 2050, climate change will cause approximately 250,000 additional deaths per year just from the direct impacts of malnutrition, malaria, diarrhea, and heat stress alone.
250,000 extra deaths per year.
Just from those four factors, yeah. And as global temperatures continue to rise, population exposure to life-threatening heat waves will inevitably increase. And critically, the burden will fall most heavily on the world's most vulnerable populations, particularly those in developing countries who have contributed the least historically to the underlying greenhouse gas emissions causing the problem. It's a major equity issue on a global scale.
So in this context of escalating risk, what does effective adaptation look like? What should governments be doing?
Effective adaptation really requires robust and comprehensive heat response plans at all levels of government, national, regional, local. Key components of such plans typically include things like reliable early warning systems for heat waves linked to clear action protocols, updating building codes to ensure new infrastructure is more resilient to heat, providing targeted support for the most vulnerable populations, perhaps using data-driven tools like a heat vulnerability index to identify high-risk neighborhoods or groups. And crucially, it requires long-term climate-informed urban planning that integrates heat mitigation strategies like greening and cool infrastructure into all future development projects. It has to become standard practice.
It sounds like a massive, coordinated effort is needed. We've truly explored the double-edged sword of sun and heat exposure today, haven't we? This is undoubtedly one of the most significant and rapidly escalating environmental health challenges of the 21st century. We've detailed that dual nature of sunlight essential for vitamin D and maybe other beneficial photo products, yet simultaneously a potent and proven carcinogen causing millions of cancers. And we've also unpacked the heat spectrum from, manageable heat stress that our bodies can cope with up to the catastrophic and often fatal systemic failure that is heat stroke.
Yeah, and I think the crucial takeaway here, as we've discussed throughout, is how this deep dive has really underscored the systemic nature of the problem. It moves far beyond just individual choices or behaviors.
Right. It's bigger than just remembering sunscreen.
Much bigger.
Yeah.
We've shown that the immense health and economic burdens resulting from these exposures are, in many ways, systematically offloaded onto the most vulnerable segments of society: the elderly, the poor, communities of color. And this is due to that toxic combination of maybe some biological susceptibility, yes, but more importantly, those deeply entrenched structural inequities that dictate exposure levels and the capacity people have to adapt.
Yeah, connecting the dots.
Exactly. We've connected the molecular biology of DNA damage all the way up to the macroeconomics of urban planning and infrastructure investment. We've linked individual psychology and behavior to global climate policy. It really proves this is a systemic issue, and therefore it demands a systemic response, not just individual advice.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener, as we think about moving forward from here? Well, consider the economic implications alone for a moment. Those multi-billion-dollar annual costs we talked about, the $8.9 billion annually for skin cancer treatment, the $1 billion plus in excess healthcare costs from heat events each year in the U.S. You called it a massive regressive climate tax.
Yeah, because it disproportionately hits public funds and the elderly.
Right. It's disproportionately levied on public funds, with Medicare being the single largest payer for skin cancer treatment, largely because the highest prevalence is in adults over 65. This reframes prevention, as you said, not just as a health strategy, but really as a fiscal imperative.
Sure.
Investing in preventative measures like public shade initiatives, urban greening programs, maybe subsidies for cool roofs, these can robustly be argued as long-term cost-saving measures that will reduce future Medicare expenditures and lessen the economic drag on the nation.
Sound fiscal policy, basically.
Exactly. Now, as we wrap up, I want to encourage you, our listener, to reflect on something we touched on, what we've called the sunshine benefit paradox. If vitamin D supplements alone don't seem to fully replicate the broad health benefits associated with sun exposure, it really suggests a complex, perhaps synergistic interaction of various photo products made in the skin beyond just vitamin D.
Yeah, there's still a lot we don't know about all the effects of sunlight.
Right. And this raises a really tricky question for public health messaging, doesn't it? How can we effectively navigate this nuance? How can we promote, perhaps, moderate and controlled sun exposure, maybe on the order of 10 to 30 minutes daily, just arms and face for lighter-skinned individuals, less for darker skin to potentially maximize these holistic benefits, while still minimizing the cumulative DNA damage that we know drives carcinogenesis?
It's a very difficult balance to strike in messaging.
It really is. In a world that often craves oversimplified information and easy answers, how can we champion a more nuanced understanding of our environment's complex interactions with our health? That's something to mull over until our next deep dive.
Concierge Care, providing world-class, personalized care for patients and members. Taking a proactive approach by offering its free digital health clinic for anyone in need of these services. Reach out to us via our website, www.health.conciergecare.net, or give us a phone call at 786-809-2345.